Ideally, this process should begin in earnest during sophomore year. This gives you enough runway to make necessary updates to documentation, build self-advocacy skills, and thoroughly research options. I'm Jenny Scherson, ex-special educator turned dyslexia interventionist. It wasn't so long ago that I, too, was overwhelmed by balanced literacy versus structured literacy, education speak, and everything in between. Fast forward after many, many hours of self-driven education, and you'll see I've built a thriving dyslexia practice helping students from age 6 to 18. My specialties? Working with the quote-unquote difficult, almost always 2E, student, and breaking down the complexities of dyslexia into everyday language strategies and action steps. You've been on this journey with your dyslexic child for years. The IEP meetings, the tutoring sessions, the late nights working through assignments, and those proud moments when they mastered skills that came so much harder to them than their peers. Now, as high school speeds by, you're facing a whole new challenge, preparing them for college, where you won't be there to advocate at every turn. On today's episode, we're talking about that critical transition from high school to college for dyslexic students. This is a time filled with excitement, but also a lot of anxiety for both you and your team. You might be wondering, will they get the accommodations they need? Can they advocate for themselves? How do they choose a college that will support them? Whether your child is a sophomore starting to think about college, a junior deep in the search process, or a senior making final decisions, today's episode will give you practical steps to ensure they're ready for this next big chapter. Let's first talk about timing, because preparing a dyslexic student for college isn't something you want to start thinking about in the spring of their senior year. Ideally, this process should begin in earnest during sophomore year. This gives you enough runway to make necessary updates to documentation, build self-advocacy skills, and thoroughly research options. For juniors, it's time to start thinking about updating any testing. Many colleges require documentation that's no more than 3 to 5 years old. So if your child's last comprehensive evaluation is in middle school, it may be time for an update. Junior year is also when college visits really start kicking off, so knowing what to look for in a school's support services becomes critical. For seniors, the focus shifts to finalizing college choices, applications, and preparing for that transfer of responsibility. The summer before college is particularly crucial. It's your last chance to help them practice independent living skills and self-advocacy before they're on their own. A quick note here. If you're listening to this and thinking, but my child is already halfway through their senior year, don't panic. We'll cover steps you can take even if you're starting this process later than ideal. Let's dive into documentation, which is absolutely critical for the college transition. This is one area where I see many families get caught off guard. Here's what you need to understand. The documentation requirements for college accommodations are typically more stringent than what high schools accept. Colleges generally want a comprehensive psychoeducational or neuropsychological evaluation that's current, again, within that 3 to 5 year time period. Why is this? In high school, your child has been covered under IDEA, which very clearly lays out the requirements for evaluations and services. The school was required to evaluate and provide services. In college, it's a different legal framework entirely, which we'll talk about in a moment. If your child's last evaluation was done through the school, it may not be comprehensive enough for college purposes. School evaluations often focus narrowly on educational impact rather than providing the detailed cognitive and processing assessments that colleges want to see. What's important to understand is that colleges are looking for current, detailed assessments that clearly connect your child's dyslexia to specific academic needs. I recently worked with a family whose child was denied accommodations because their documentation, while thorough for high school purposes, didn't meet the college standards. This can be heartbreaking after years of support in K through 12. Making sure you have the right documentation before applying is critical to a smooth transition. If you're not sure if your child's documentation is sufficient, call the disability service offices at a few colleges your child is considering and ask what they require. This can save you a lot of headaches later. Now, Let's talk about what I consider one of the most important shifts in the transition to college, the change in legal protection and responsibilities. In K through 12, your child has been protected by IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is focused on ensuring students receive a free, appropriate public education. Under IDEA, the school is responsible for identifying students with disabilities, providing evaluations, and developing an appropriate educational program. It is an entitlement law. If your child qualifies, they are entitled to services. But here's where everything changes. IDEA doesn't apply to colleges and universities. Instead, higher education is governed by the American Disabilities Act, ADA, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. These are civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination, but they don't proactively provide services. I need to be crystal clear about this point. Neither your child's IEP nor their 504 plan will transfer to college. These documents are specific to K through 12 education and have no legal standing in higher education. Your child is essentially starting fresh in terms of establishing their accommodation needs at the college level. The history of accommodations may be helpful as supporting evidence, but the plans themselves do not carry over. What does this mean in practical terms? It means three major shifts that you and your child need to be prepared for. First, in college, your child has to self-identify as having a disability. No one will come looking for them to offer help. Second, they need to provide their own documentation and specifically request accommodations. It's no longer the institution's responsibility to identify needs. And third, this is a big one, colleges are required to provide equal access, but they're not required to provide services that would fundamentally alter their programs. So, while extra time on tests might be readily approved, something like modified reading assignments might not be. Parents, this is where I see the biggest stumbling blocks. Your child is moving from a system where the school had significant responsibility to a system where all the responsibility falls on your child. This is why developing self-advocacy skills becomes so critical. Now, let's talk about what I consider the most crucial skill for college success: self-advocacy. In college, your child would need to be able to explain their disability, understand their rights, and articulate their specific accommodation needs, often to professors who have varying levels of understanding about dyslexia. So, how do you help them develop these skills? Start practicing now. Self-advocacy is perhaps the most crucial skill for college success, yet it is often the least developed during high school years. Unlike in K through 12, where you as a parent could step in when things weren't working, in college, your child needs to be their own advocate. I recently worked with a bright dyslexic student who struggled his first semester, not because he couldn't do the work, but because he couldn't effectively communicate his needs to professors. He'd never had to explain his dyslexia or request accommodations because his parents and the IEP team had always handled this for him. Developing these self-advocacy skills requires a deliberate, step-by-step approach that builds confidence over time. The key is starting this process early enough that these skills become second nature before they're needed in the higher stakes college environment. Remember, self-advocacy is a skill that develops over time. Don't expect perfection right away, but do provide opportunities for practice before the stakes get high in college. As we wrap up today's episode, I want to acknowledge that this transition can feel overwhelming. You've been your child's advocate for so long, and stepping back isn't easy. But remember, you're not abandoning them, you're empowering them. Let's summarize some key action steps based on where you are in this journey. If your child is a sophomore or junior, schedule updated testing if needed. Research colleges with strong support services, and begin building self-advocacy skills. If your child is a senior, finalize college choices with support services in mind. Ensure all documentation is current and organized. Practice conversations with professors about accommodations, and create structures for communication once they're at college. For all parents, remember that this transition happens gradually. Your role is shifting from manager to consultant. You're still there to provide guidance and support. If you have any further questions about preparing your dyslexic child for college, please feel free to sneak into my inbox. I'd also love your input. What has worked for your family during this transition? Are there topics related to the high school to college journey that you'd like to hear more about? Send me a DM on Instagram or drop me an email at jenny@literacyuntangled.com. That's JENNIE at literacyuntangled.com. I can't wait to hear from you. Until next time, bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Literacy Untangled. If you loved this episode as much as I did, head on over and rate and subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you want to continue the conversation or share your takeaways, head on over to our Instagram at Literacy Untangled and comment on your favorite part. I can't wait to hang out with you again soon. Bye.